My warmest greetings and deepest thanks. It is impossible to tell you how thrilled and happy I am. And know that real impact on important sections of the American community, both by this memorable occasion and by other activities occurring in the Isles. Undoubtedly, one result will be concrete activity here around the implementation of our basic freedoms. I know that this will please you all.
A good day to thee, Lord God Almighty.
That rich, beautiful voice was the singer, actor, and civil rights activist Paul Robeson in 1957, introducing a concert to an audience sitting in St. Pancras Town Hall in London. Astonishingly, Paul Robeson was in New York at the time, and he was performing live over a transatlantic phone line.
Surely the sons of the oppressed, whoever suffers, ever the sons of the oppressed.
Robeson was an outspoken critic of lynching laws and racism in general. Because of his support of these causes, he was a victim of early attempts by the US FBI to quash civil rights activism and was blacklisted by the State Department, who tried in every way to defame him. But Robeson was also an innovator who used the latest tools to go around the restrictions that were imposed upon him. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll hear a familiar tale, one that continues to be relevant today. When the authorities increasingly tried to silence him, he used technology to make his voice heard. Here's John Liffin, curator of communication and electricity at the Science Museum, to introduce us to an element from the cable that made the transatlantic concert possible.
What's in front of us is a submarine cable repeater. And a repeater is an amplifier. And it's used to boost a signal as it passes under the sea on the bed of the ocean. So it was used on the very first long-distance telephone submarine cable. Now, we'd had telegraph links between the major continents right back into the 19th century. The problem is, for speech needs a much more complex signal, and that deteriorates quite quickly as you go along the line. And you have to boost that signal at intervals in order that it reaches the other end just as good as when it left. In the middle of the 20th century and stimulated by the Second World War, new types of electronics, new valves were developed, and that made it possible to make a repeater which you could bury at the bottom of the ocean and leave possibly for years' time, knowing that it would work reliably, but it would boost your telephone signal from one side of the Atlantic to the other.
TAT-1 was laid between 1955 and 1956, and it linked Newfoundland, Canada, and Oban on the west coast of Scotland. It's one of 5 items that we're featuring in this series from the many in the Information Age Gallery at the Science Museum in London. Information Age tells the story of the evolution and how we communicate with one another. The objects in the gallery represent cultural moments from the last 200 years, not just technological innovations. Tilly Blythe, keeper of technology at the Science Museum and lead curator of the Information Age Gallery, told me why she was keen to put this repeater on display.
For the Information Age Gallery, it's really important to us that we're telling this story of the hidden infrastructure, the things that nobody ever thinks about, the stuff behind the scenes, the cables that are sitting at the bottom of the sea, the base station that takes your mobile phone call, all the things that make this network possible. It's not just the device you hold in your hand, it's all the other stuff that really makes the telecoms networks work.
Before the gallery opened, I joined Tilly and John at the Science Museum's archive in Wiltshire to have a peek at the TAT-1, the infrastructure that connected the UK and North America with such remarkable clarity.
This is Dr. Hill in London. Is that you, Mr. Craig?
This is Mr. Craig.
Well, it's very good to hear your voice and to join with you and our friends in Canada in inaugurating the first transatlantic telephone cable service. But it's not too sentimental, I hope to say, that as the people of our 3 countries use this cable more and more, the ties of friendship and understanding between us will grow the stronger.
We certainly share your feeling, Dr. Hill.
Laying the TAT-1 may have affirmed ties of friendship and understanding, but it ultimately became the latest innovation after the telegraph to challenge the control that states have over the voices of their citizens. And that was due in no small part to the way that it brought new levels of communication access to the people. Here's Tilly Blythe again.
So as a result of the TAT-1, you had far cheaper international phone calls between America and Britain. The quality of the calls was much, much clearer. So this really liberated telephony. Before this point, you're looking at about £9 for a 3-minute call. This brings it down to £3 for a 3-minute call. So it's a much, much more open technology to a whole range of people that didn't have access to it before this comes along. And that does change the way that communication works. So you have an interesting time where you're really allowing a whole range of people to make calls that haven't happened before. And that opens up a whole range of issues for governments who might be trying to control the messages that are coming out or the way that communication is happening within a country. So it changes the whole relationship, really.
And this is echoed today as many governments struggle with how to control communication online. In the 1940s and 50s, the U.S. government didn't want Paul Robeson to be heard outside its boundaries. But the TAT-1 made that irrelevant. Before the Second World War, Robeson had been a star on both sides of the Atlantic. He'd brought spirituals to a wide audience, he'd performed Othello at the Savoy Theatre in London, and he was the first international black film star making his name and his voice in Showboat. Highly educated, enormously empathetic, and incredibly charismatic, his activism was seen as a threat to America after the war. This was an era in that country dominated by fears of the other. From the 1940s, Robeson was wiped from records, public appearances were cancelled, articles making false claims were written in magazines and distributed internationally at the behest of FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover. Finally, in 1950, his passport was confiscated. Still, his fans from around the world wanted to see their star. Tony Howard, professor of English at Warwick University, has studied the FBI files on Paul Robeson.
In 1952, he was planning to give a concert in Canada, just over the border, where you didn't need a passport. But I think almost uniquely, the State Department imposed a bar on him travelling there as well. Quite extraordinary. So there were several parts of the Americas which normally any American could travel to, but he couldn't. And there are FBI telegrams, very, very urgent, telling people from Washington, get to the border because he's in a car on the way. Well, what happened was, and this is really important for our story, he found a way of circumventing it, which was to sing on the American side of the border to an audience on the Canadian side of the border. And these famous, they're called the Peace Arch concerts, ran through most of the 1950s. And it indicated both his determination to sing to whoever wanted to hear, but also a kind of black comedy mockery of the whole idea of borders. And then in subsequent years, he began to use tape recordings, which he would send to conferences or to concerts that he couldn't attend. So he was very, very attuned to what technology could do.
Even today, there are examples of people using technology to cross borders, like whistleblower Edward Snowden, currently in a state of exile, who keynotes conferences via Skype. Paul Robeson used what technology was at his disposal. He'd lived in the UK in the 1930s, studying at SOAS in London, and had a strong following in this country, including major figures from the arts, like Benjamin Britten and Kingsley Amis. When the British group Let Robeson Sing unsuccessfully lobbied the US State Department to allow Paul to tour the British Isles, they saw the opportunity to use the TAT-1 to hold a transatlantic concert. After a lot of persuasion and a fight to get the cost down to £91 for the phone line, it went ahead.
Apparently, the concert tickets, 1,000, sold out within an hour, which we don't think is very much nowadays because of the internet. But in those days, you had to go down and you had to do it physically. So it was a very, very important newspaper story. But as you might expect, therefore, there was quite a lot of aggressive reporting of it in papers like the Daily Express. who denounced him as someone who'd caused great trouble to the British Empire.
While the moon her watch is keeping all through the night.
Not long after this concert, Robeson's passport was returned to him, and he was once again granted permission to travel. Perhaps the authorities realized that their attempts to keep people silent by restricting them to one physical location were futile. Technology that transported people around the globe was affordable, accessible, and now available to all.
Paul? Hello? Hello, Paul?
Hello? Yes, he's here. You want to speak to him?
Yeah, oh, yes, please.
Just a moment. He'll come onto another microphone. Just one moment, please.
Thank you.
Right.
Hello?
Hello, Paul.
Hello?
Hello, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, wonderful.
Will it come over all right?
Oh, I can't tell you.
That's wonderful.
People were really astounded. You know, they didn't know that the quality was going to be so good. So you can hear on the recording is saying, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Paul?" And when Paul responds, that they're not sure initially if they were actually hearing a record or actually hearing his voice live. It's such good quality that they, you know, that amazing room being filled with his voice was astounding, really, that it felt like he was in the room with them.
And the Tat 1 wasn't just used for rock concerts. It was also used, for example, during the height of the Cold War as connections between the Kremlin and the US.
So later in the 1960s, it became the hotline between the Kremlin and Washington. So it was the secret line that was used for sending messages between the two. And that wasn't a voice line. That was actually using a teleprinter because it was perceived to be so important that those messages weren't misconstrued or misunderstood, that you couldn't do that via voice communication. It had to be dealt with in words.
Technology continues to allow people to share ideas, even when governments don't want them to. It gets information to people all over the world, allowing us to see civil injustice, war, and political corruption. Paul Robeson gave just one more telephone concert before he returned to the UK. But in 1961, he retired. The Information Age Gallery at the Science Museum recognizes Robeson's contribution to technologically enabled free speech. It may have been a feat of infrastructure innovation, but the Tat 1 story is actually about democratizing communication and bringing the voices of the silent to the ears of the crowd.
They want you to sing Can We Afford It? £2 a minute. Paul, will you sing Old Man River? Paul, he's gone.
No, I'm right here.
No.
Just a second.
How about it? How about singing Old Man River?
Just a second.
£2 a minute. We want it. We'll pay for it.
Must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling. He keeps on rolling along.